Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, and thank you for joining us for our session this evening. It is a great pleasure that I'm joined by three subject matter experts who will be joining me on a conversation surrounding ethics. As many of you will know from the Eventbrite post, this is just because you can doesn't mean you should. My name is Daniel Cope. I am the chair this evening. I'm the vice chairman of the British Computer Society Data Management Specialist Group. I have worked in the data management, data privacy arena for just over 10 years. I'm a senior subject matter expert. I work within the financial sector as a head of department, running a number of departments, as well as vice chairman for defence and security for the National Liberal Club. I've recently been awarded the City of London Freedom, and amongst other things. So it is an esteemed pleasure to have you all join us this evening. We are recording this session. This session will be available on the British Computer Society members' YouTube channel up to 48 to 72 hours after the event completion. We are taking questions towards the end of the presentation. If you have any questions that you would like to ask myself, the panel, and throughout this event, there is no such thing as a silly question, so please don't feel self-conscious in any way. Please submit those to Glenn. When you push the chat function, you'll see a little drop down which says to. Click that button and you are able to type in Glenn. He is registered as a co-host. Please do send your questions directly to Glenn rather than to everyone so that it doesn't disturb the presentation as we go through. It's with great pleasure that I'm now going to pass over to our first speaker to introduce her wonderful self. Beth, over to yourself.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me as well. I am Beth Zingler. I am the Junior Research Fellow in Artificial Intelligence at Homerton College here at the University of Cambridge. And my work is primarily around understanding and observing the cultural response to artificial intelligence, and also how people interact with the concept of AI and how it informs their life choices and what kinds of life choices are then also impacting on them. So it's a whole question around what is society in relation to AI and what do we think AI is? So I'm going to share a couple of slides I have just to talk through some of the things I've been thinking about lately in response to the title of this session. So just share there. It's that one. Always takes a second. There, I hope everyone can see that. So the immediate response I had to the title of this session was actually to ask, but what if people already think that you have? Just because you can doesn't mean you should, but actually we're already seeing people responding to AI as though we're actually at a stage where all the things that we've dreamed of are actually here. And I think also this title evokes, if you're familiar with Jurassic Park, Ian Malcolm's statement along the same sort of lines when science fiction account of resurrecting dinosaurs, your scientists so preoccupied with thinking about whether they could, they didn't stop to think if they should. And very quickly, for my mind anyway, as an anthropologist who thinks about representations of AI, we get to the dystopia of Westworld and these kinds of imageries of the robot rebellion. But it's very important to note, obviously, that these kinds of performances of what AI and robots are very much based in fiction. The problem arises, and what I want to dig into around AI ethics, is when these fictional representations bleed into the real world and get picked up by the people we should be relying on for transparency and illumination when it comes to the uses of data and our privacy. So, for instance, you may have seen this speech by Boris Johnson, our Prime Minister, back in 2019, where his comment on AI, what will it mean, he said, helpful robots washing and caring for an aging population, or pink-eyed Terminators sent back from the future to call the human race. And he obviously drew there on a very strong binary between the utopian view and the dystopian view, pulling on the science fiction tropes, obviously here, of the Terminator, whereas the truth is actually much more complicated. But the impact of these kinds of narratives and the stories that are being told, in this case, by some of our most senior government officials, really causes problems. It's a typo there, I can just see. It leads to a lack of transparency about the abilities of AI, not a lake of transparency, though that's an interesting concept, but also where the human is still very much involved in the decision-making process. And that makes it much harder to debate AI ethics because the conversation gets wrapped up in all these personified versions of artificial intelligence. And a particular example I want to draw attention to here is the A-levels algorithm that caused so many problems last summer. I'm involved in admissions at my college. I saw some of this element. I saw so many people working so hard to help all these children, young adults, get to where they wanted to be. And this all arose because of a grading algorithm that limited the numbers of how many students could receive certain grades based on historical data from their schools. So you could be the most stunningly amazing student, but if your school had not traditionally done well, you'd be downgraded. So the predicted grades were based on those historic successes or failures. And this led to around 40% of students receiving downgraded results and horrendous problems for them. And here I have an image from some of the protests, and the response was quite graphic in cases, you can see there from the signs. And the narrative again here from Boris Johnson, he's not my favorite politician, where he blamed mutant algorithms for this exam fiasco, whereas actually the algorithm, a very, very simple algorithm, did purely what it was told to do. There's no agency, we can talk about agency in a Latourian sense of every object has agency on other things, but there was no intention to ruin people's lives. So I think I want to draw attention to the impact of personification on how we even get to debate AI ethics when for public discourse, and I want to draw in the public as a concern here, is so wrapped up in the representations of AI and robots, including one of my bugbears here, Sophia, the Hanson robot, who will talk about wanting to destroy humans, which completely derails what we should be talking about in terms of societal ethics and harms. If you're more interested in my take on this, I produced a short series of documentaries about AI and robotics, and the third one with a company called Dragonlight Films called Good in the Machine, played with personification in the fictional elements, but also interviews a lot of experts who are very, very good on AI ethics and concerns about what's actually going to happen in the near future. Thank you. I've rattled through very quickly there, but I want to give as much time as possible for other people to speak. So if you want to get in touch with me to discuss this further, there's some of my contact details. I'm very Googleable as well. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you, Beth. And I think there you highlight some key reasons that really touch on just because you can doesn't mean you should. We're now going to pass over to Maria. Maria, would you like to give us a short introduction to yourself? And over to you.
Thank you so much, Dan, and good evening, everyone. Greetings from Romania, where it is 8:30 and is not as hot as in the UK. My name is Maria Accente. I work for PwC UK, which is one of the big professional services companies, and my role is to help companies be ready for the adoption of AI and help them build the right capability to deal with the moral implication and impact of AI. And what we have seen in the last 4 years since this whole public debate around AI has started, a further acknowledgement in the C-suite and other major decision-making in the private and the public sector about the huge potential of AI to disrupt the way we do business. And with that, the fact that there are some moral questions that should be asked, and we don't have the capacity to ask those questions, neither because we have the understanding of what AI really is, or because we are not prepared to deal with something that is truly stochastic in nature, because most of our processes are linear in nature. I work with clients across industries, from financial services to public sector and health, alongside the data science team, to be able to raise awareness of where all those questions should be asked, who should answer those questions, and how to move from a point where everything is permitted, we can do a lot with technology, into something that's much more responsible in nature, and being able to consider early on all the implication of developing a technology that operates at the scale AI does, has the agency and adaptation that AI has, but in the same time being able to reap most of the benefits while we're keeping an eye on all the possible risks. And the biggest challenge our clients pose is how to see this operationalization of AI ethics as a truly holistic and systemic exercise, not just as a linear approach where you draft ethical principles to establish some boards, or you have some processes where you consider various ethical principles, but how do you support this transformation with right incentives and with right measure that will give you enough time to see positive results going forward? And while my job is not as exciting as Beth, I do spend a lot of time talking with my colleagues and trying to demystify and take their attention from AI that means for many still Terminators or Sophia the robot into a world of much more boring, but linked to the current AI capabilities, and with that, what we should be doing collectively in order to have a better outcome with AI. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria. I think that's fantastic and very interesting. And I'm sure quite regularly you'll see challenges with clients, especially working for a consultancy there as well. But last but most certainly not least, we have our third speaker, who is Neil. Neil, do you want to give us a little bit of an introduction to yourself?
Yes, I'm Neil Lawrence. I'm Professor of Machine Learning, University of Cambridge. I've been working in machine learning for 25 years now, since before it was a thing. And I've seen it emerge as the principal technology underlying the current revolution in artificial intelligence. On the subject, I really like what Beth and Maria said. I thought that they gave a really nice overview of some of the issues, particularly when Beth was talking about the dichotomies. And just because you can doesn't mean you should. Quite frankly, very often we can't. And there's a lot of myths about what's possible that I think Beth was alluding to. So what's my position on all this? Well, I guess I spent the first 20 years of my career making these methods work. And then I got to a point where I realized, oh, these are working. And something that's always inspired me is trying to do things in personalized health. So recommendations that help us deal with health crises like the ones we're experiencing at the moment, because there's a lot of potential for these methods there. But I got to the point where I realized that the issues weren't going to be necessarily with the algorithms, but everything else around the algorithms. And I thought, to be honest, that that was going to be handled by people who were carefully thinking about this stuff. And then the care.data fiasco happened. So the care.data 1.0, I think we're now calling it, because there's been at least 2 health data scandals since then. I think we're talking about 9 years ago, 10 years ago, when there was a release of what was called the General Practice Data Research Data Link. And people had to opt in or out, and a lot of concerns about what it meant to make this health data available. And I sort of got interested in issues around data and machine learning at that point. And I guess at the end of the day, they all end up, one could say that they're all sort of ethical issues. That's me.
Thank you, Neil. That's really interesting, and obviously, from your perspective, you must see a lot of interesting challenges on a day-to-day basis, just from your students in general. So I think we'll kick off the ball to baseline understanding. What is ethics and what is AI? What do both of those mean? What does the acronym AI stand for? Who wants to kick us off, or I'll pick on one of you? Neil, do you want to kick us off there?
So AI itself, I think, is a difficult term. It's one that seems to have been adopted to describe these technologies, but it means different things to different people. And it's a very emotive term because it contains the word intelligence, and people consider intelligence to be something very specific to themselves. So it's not always helpful in that regard. But I would say it has been very helpful in forcing a conversation around what it means to deploy technology in society, because that's effectively what's going on. And if we look back historically, we can see things like containerization. And if I mention containerization, so I worked for 3 years in the Amazon supply chain, deploying machine learning solutions. Your life is totally dominated by containerization because it led to globalization. It means that it's cheaper to take prawns that are caught off the coast of Scotland, export them to China for shelling, and re-import them back. And it's cheaper because the cost of labor is so much higher in Scotland versus China, and the cost of transport is low because of containerization. This is a radical change to society. You may also be aware of it when Robbie Fowler, the footballer, lifted his shirt in support of the Liverpool Dockers in the 1990s, because all the Dockers got sacked as well. But I don't think most people are aware of this as even an underlying phenomenon that drives society. I think ethics is a dangerous term. I find that people who talk about themselves as ethicists are often less interesting on ethics than people who are just trying to deliver things and have thought carefully about the issue. But I think that the real challenges we're facing is that these new range of technologies, just like containerization automated the process of moving goods, these machine learning systems, AI is automated decision-making, and that's going to have a direct impact on people's lives. And we need to engage with people and understand how they feel about that. And it needs to be something that they feel they're controlling, not something that's controlling them. So I don't think, in some sense, the terms are not helpful in one way, but they're very helpful in bringing a conversation together. And then I think, as Beth did very well, trying to diffuse that conversation away from the sort of the images of the pink-eyed Terminator and bring it to a place that's a bit more useful to help people understand decisions that are being made about them and how they can help influence those.
Thank you. I think that was really interesting. Beth, I could see you nodding along there. Did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I totally agree with Neil's assessment of both AI and ethics. I think it's important to also think about the ways in which ethics is being utilized as a narrative by organizations and corporations that are turning on to the idea that actually, if we want to look good, we also need to have ethics departments, ethics being presented in a particular way. We tend to call that ethics washing. And it's a question of also who gets to call themselves an ethicist and why. There's a sort of level of legitimacy there. I never generally call myself an ethicist, even though I discuss what other people think are the ethical responses and uses of AI. I don't think that's appropriate for me. And we have to think about what this is as an emerging field of almost professionalization. I see more and more sort of certifications of ethical behavior in ways that are very interesting. And what do the general public think AI ethics is as well? I did, off the back of Good in the Machine, which is the third film I mentioned, a survey of people's responses to it. And a lot of the time, as I said, the ethics questions, all the big scale ones, and not the immediate scale questions of what would it mean for an automated decision-making system to decide I can't have insurance or a mortgage or be treated at a hospital in a particular way based on previous conditions. All these sorts of questions that have immediate societal impact. They're all, again, running off to the Terminator.
Definitely. I think it's very interesting that I think we have to be very careful with automated decisioning and things making assumptions based on logical data, as highlighted in your small presentation to start. Maria, did you want to add anything to that?
I was listening to what Neil was saying about the term AI, and obviously we all know that AI suffers from not being well defined. But when you're in industry and you're trying to benefit of those technological advancements, you need to define it so that you kind of know exactly what you're talking about. And while AI is still a sexy term and everyone wants to talk about it, everyone wants to work in AI, I think the tendencies I've seen, especially with my team and our clients, is to actually name the technologies that will form a solution that address a real problem. So one of the first things that we have done when we established the Center of Excellence in PwC is to say, we don't necessarily care about the big definition being given by researchers or by academics on what is AI, but where in concern is actually to come up with a definition that is quite workable, and it's to be understood by those who are in charge with funding, so that we actually start prioritizing some initiatives and being able to build something that ultimately delivers a return on investment. So we went and said very simply that in terms of AI, we understand the set of technologies that will mimic or copy some of the human intelligence traits like sensing, thinking, doing, and learning. And with that, we define a very a clear set of technologies: NLP, machine learning, deep learning, conversational agents, simulation and optimizations, and conversational agents, so that when we started discussing with our colleagues and our clients, we were able to articulate how those emerging technology could make a difference to the problems that they were hoping to solve. And we fought many wars. Like we had to go to our colleagues and have this honest conversation about what AI is not, very much tap into the work Beth and her colleagues in Cambridge are doing, and say, but AI is not terminated. The current capabilities of AI are very far from what is being portrayed in the press. But in order for us to move along, we need to be focusing on boring AI and more menial applications that sometimes are the most basic machine learning developments that probably wouldn't surprise Neil, because obviously they're quite boring. And link with that, we try to bring the conversation about AI ethics from the domain of abstraction and the feel-good factor, and again, something that's very concrete. And the way we position it, or the way I position it, is to say, but do you understand what are the moral implications of what you're doing, and how far those implications go, not just in your team or where this tool is going to be used in the process, but in the wider society. And we start from there. And yes, I'm totally with Beth. Yes, there is the term of ethics washing, and you've seen it, especially with the big tech companies. But I'm here personally to actually fight the ethics washings and challenge my colleagues and our clients to start really thinking through, what does it mean if we build and release this technology, not just today, tomorrow, not just for how we design and deploy and use it, but also how we maintain it long term. And business has not had to ask those questions in the past. We did not have to reflect on moral consideration when it comes to technology, for this is very novel for us. So while we benefit of all this conversation that happen in the public domain and all the research is being done, our job is to make it real. Our job is to make it connected to real problem first and foremost, and also looking what are the huge opportunities where we can actually, there's not a problem we can solve, but a huge opportunity where we can deploy this technology and make a big difference. And while we do this, we keep our hands in the stand, and sometimes we actually have to let go the big terms, AI and big terms of ethics, and focus on something that's much more concrete to allow us again to deliver value. For us right now, very important, and for the rest of the industry and our clients, what is important is to demonstrate that this emerging technology can deliver value and have a positive impact.
Definitely. I think you touched on some really interesting points there. That one, in relations to individuals thinking, I think artificial intelligence is a magic wand and it will solve every problem ever since in the organization, and it can automate procedures and operations and policy to allow you to cut costs and other items, as well as those ethical considerations. We've not had to have those kind of conversations at board level. And it's individuals quite often at board level don't really understand how the technology itself works in the first place. So it's how you deliver that technology. And it comes down to, just because you can doesn't mean you should. And one of actually the points when we were formulating this event is, it's regularly I see items myself where you want to do processing and analytics and items like that. And it's, where do you get the trade-off between ethics and obviously law? Law is obviously the MVP, the risk versus consequence view, whereas ethics is somewhat right versus wrong. And is there ever a middle ground? Can you be partially ethical and partially not? Can you 1 minute say, oh, I'm not going to do something because that's unethical, versus then saying, oh, no, that won't worry, let's risk accept, which obviously organizations are, I think, jostling with on a daily basis. So I think you touch on some really interesting points there. And I think ties in very nicely to one of the questions that we have for this evening is, how do we ensure there is a balance between the benefit of AI and that between the organizational factors of the usage of that data, individuals, and society as a whole? One such example could be the usage of sexuality data. Sending that kind of data to Saudi Arabia is completely legal, but sending that data to a country where homosexuality may be considered illegal in that country, it's legal to send the data there, but you could be putting people at risk. So where does the ethics align versus, say, for example, you wanted to determine that individuals in your organization are being treated fairly. So you're using that data with an analytics team to ensure that there's no marginalization. So where is the balance between benefits, risks for the organizations, the individuals, and society? I can see Maria, you say, or Neil.
I just want to say, I don't think it's legal to send data about people's sexuality to Saudi Arabia. GDPR expressly forbids that. Any protected data characteristics. As a data controller, you are responsible for ensuring that those don't go outside the country. You're not allowed to do that. And in fact, I think that it's one of the great problems we've got at the moment, that people don't understand what the GDPR is trying to do and how it's trying to work, or how to deploy it, and the help it gives us in some of these guidelines. So yeah, if it's health data or sexuality or I think religious faith, race, I'm missing one or two, then these are protected characteristics, and you cannot send that data to Saudi Arabia or anywhere else for that matter. I don't know what the latest is within the European Union on that, because whatever. But
I'm afraid, yeah, Neil, actually that is incorrect. Under the General Data Protection Regulation, it does not set a provision for that.
If you are a data controller, Daniel, that is not something that you should be doing. As a data
Most
controller,
certainly you shouldn't do it, but doesn't mean you
No, it's illegal.
Yeah.
Daniel, it's illegal.
I can most certainly assure you it is not. As long as you've conducted your privacy impact assessment and made a determination, you can process sensitive personal information realistically however you see.
You can't send it to Saudi Arabia for processing. You have to say how you are processing it. The data has to be stored within the country. I mean, within the domain, which used to be the EU. You cannot do that. There are a lot of really good laws already in this space. And one problem is that we are not teaching people what the benefit of those laws, and we're scaremongering around them. So people are talking about repealing GDPR because it's a barrier, when it's exactly doing the opposite of what you said there, Daniel. It's preventing people doing that as data controllers. You can't just send data out, personally protected data. You're under an obligation to process it according to the GDPR. These are protected characteristics. You can't even make decisions on that data that are of a significant nature without a bunch of provisions around it. But having said that, you know, underlying your question, there's a bunch of other stuff going on. I'm less worried about the sort of things we have in the GDPR, and I've written extensively about the issues that we face where there are not significant decisions being made about you according to a number of different things that may not be personally protected characteristics. And we're facing a world where that's happening to all of us now. So one of the things we all face, for example, is on Google, or we face on Facebook, is a number of decisions that are each individually consequential about what our newsfeed appears like or what adverts we're showing. But overall, that's presenting a picture of the world that is being controlled by an entity that is not you, that is being controlled by an outside company, and is all being driven by your personal data, even though it's not protected in the same way that sexuality data is protected. That's quite a big problem, and it's an emergent one that wasn't there when the sort of GDPR legislation, which goes all the way back to the sort of early 1980s, was conceived of, because this just wasn't the thing. And so there's a lot of interesting regulation around that there's things that are legal to do that your customer base may not be comfortable with. And we're seeing that coming up a lot. We're also seeing situations where people are making assumptions about what businesses are doing with their data, which they aren't even doing. So when people see coincidental predictions about something that they feel must be derived from their personal data, they feel very uncomfortable. And often that's just a coincidence, but people remember those coincidences. I think that it's a really difficult period. You mentioned regulation, Daniel, and regulation is there in some parts, but it's clear that there's this challenge where technology moves faster than the regulation. And we end up in a position where the rules that lawyers would normally use, the right or wrong, as you put it, rules that lawyers would normally use to dictate what you do, is no longer applicable. You actually have to try and think about what your customers think, what people would feel about it, what perception about these decisions would be. And that is much, much more complicated. And indeed, one problem is that a lot of what we've done is we built ecosystems, like take General Data Protection Regulation. That's a nonsense name. The initial name of the first act is protection of the individual as pertaining to their personally private data, or words to that effect, protection of the individual. But we're using terms like data protection as if that's what's got to be protected. But no, we're trying to protect the individual with regard to their data, or things like the Internet of Things. It's not an Internet of Things, it's an Internet of people. There's a load of words that devalue what you're operating with, which is actually people with real lives in the real world. And unfortunately, that applies often to software engineers and algorithmic decision-making systems. And we need to bring those people back into the equation so that people understand that there are consequences to these decisions they make, particularly in this period before the regulation is caught up with all the damage that these things can do.
Definitely, and I think that there you hit the nail right on the head, that many organizations don't truly understand that risk versus consequence versus ethical yes and no. I think there's a big difference there. Beth, Marie, either of you want to touch on that? I think I can see Maria, you've unmute, so over to you.
Yes, while Neil was talking, I was thinking that the best answer to your question, where do risk and benefits balance, is in the context, right? We have to understand that ethics is a highly contextual story, right? The value system is very much linked to the context where that problem manifests itself. And when we say context, we mean the culture of the organization, the culture of the country, the jurisdiction of the country, and many other different norms and rules that come together to form that delicate context where humans come together to produce value. And in order to really nail it to the head, we should not rely only on laws. Law are the ultimate safety net, if you want, when we develop technology like this. And while law will never be enough, no matter how good the regulators will become in understanding and regulating this technology, what we should be aiming into fostering an ethical and moral mindset. And that sometimes comes, naturally with some companies, but others need to be pushed in that direction. And yes, that's the benefit of the law, because it pushes company to behave ethically and morally. And that's the case we have had with corporations since corporations started, have been invented. But there's another lever, if you want, another way of pushing corporation and organization in general to uphold their values, and that's the general public and most likely the customers. The customers they serve, and when customers start applying pressure, as we see this new generation, we call it the Greta Thunberg generation, that are demanding more ethical product services, right? They are asking for it. They are dropping their subscription just because their perception that the company they are consuming that product or services is not ethical enough for them. So this type of pressure that is applied where it hurts company the most, which is in their revenue, is probably one of the most effective in long term. And we've seen those changes coming, right? We've seen that at least a C-suite level, there's a lot of conversation of balancing profit with purpose, and an organization being much more the type of B Corp type corporations where they consider their impact within society rather than just impact on the wallets of the shareholders. And in this revolution of this change of reshifting priorities within big organizations, it's very much linked with those new societal value changes that we have seen from Me Too and Black Lives Matters and the climate change that is having an impact on the way the C-suite operates and thinks. And with that has an impact, of course, on how technology is being designed and used. And while we definitely should be always be grounded in what the technologies we are delivering, is ultimately we should consider not just the AI per se, but the large ecosystem of technology that come together to give us the services. Sometimes we focus so much on models and data where we forget there's a huge infrastructure ecosystems that give us the technology we see today, and that there's many issues there. You know, one of the biggest one most of our clients have is that they're still on premise, they are still not in cloud. So until they will have a better enterprise architecture for them, you know, AI is still going to be a long-term dream, because they cannot do it. And with that, they cannot tap into all the conversations we have other than theoretically and conceptually, because they can't experiment much, because the capabilities they have do not allow them to do that.
Definitely, and you're 100% correct. Beth, anything you wanted to add to that?
I think I can see some comments from the chat suggesting that we stop complimenting each other and start being critical. But unfortunately, I'm still in the position of mostly, I think that's what I'm interpreting correctly from the chat. I'm mostly in the position of agreeing with both Neil and Maria here. I would add, it's interesting to think around the way the question is framed and the fact that we separate out the corporates, the individual, and society. And I think that goes back into what both people have been saying about, you know, we've got to see the humans in the systems and the situations, that actually by dividing ourselves out from these different things, we're not actually seeing the interconnectedness of them. And I think, again, going back to Maria's point about sort of grassroots activism, the A-level protests did work to a certain extent in pushing back against the implementation of the algorithm, and there were changes made, but it has to be activism that's educated around what is actually happening. So when I was saying with the swear words versus the algorithm, the swear words should have been aimed at people in the Department of Education who made particular decisions. So again, it's the humans in the ecosystem of the AI implementation that we need to draw attention to. And I think what's going to be really important in that direction is very humanistic education in critical thinking at a very early stage for children, that teaches them what is happening with the technology that they're using. I have a young son. He's already engaged with various technologies that employ algorithms to make recommendations and system changes, much like Neil was talking about with Facebook. These are not things that are covered or prohibited by rules and regulations. They are possible, but they are led by a value system that is about enhancing attention, by ensuring clicks, by ensuring financial rewards in certain circumstances. So if we are going to expect that level of understanding and critical thinking, it has to start very young. And I have done public engagement in schools where kids have already completely bought into the narratives, the same sort of narratives of the Terminator that Boris is highlighting there in his talk as well. And if we can from the very early stages educate the public on what is happening with technology and why it's happening, then that pushback that Maria is talking about is increasingly possible, because we're pushing back against the right things.
Definitely.
If the public wants us to disagree, I'm not disagreeing with that. I'm just adding something to say that while I 100% wholeheartedly agree, we need to start educating our children on what AI is and how to live a life, a healthy life with technologies like AI. I think what we need urgently is a healthy civil society that understands this technology. We can't rely on a very small number of data and AI activists that at the moment uncovering all those misuses of algorithms, and we need more informed activists to carry those AI audits and assessment that made Cathy O'Neill so famous, because when she wrote that book, she actually went and uncovered some cases where algorithms were badly designed and deployed. And I spoke with her the other day, and she said, I fear there are thousands of examples like this all over the world, and we don't even know they exist because they're hidden in opaque business, in opaque operations, in opaque organization. And the damage they inflict, we sometimes put it on inequality that exists in our systems, and we don't have the ability to detect it. So we urgently need, people that have a certain understanding of technology in general to start upskilling themselves in understanding where AI can potentially harm, and start being those who uncover those wrongs and being able to address it. And one of the things that we discussed quite a lot with our clients is that they are very much aware they actually might carry this type of systems that are biased and sometimes discriminatory, but they do not have the right skills to go and dig deep, and they do not have what we call AI auditors to go and assess their systems. So I think we urgently need people not only to train as data scientists, but also as compliance and AI auditors that will have the ability not only to understand how to build a system, but also how they operate and how they operate in real life, and being able to adjust their functioning to a certain set of parameters.
Definitely. I think you're 100% right. This is obviously one of the reasons why the Information Commissioner's Office recently undertook their survey to look and build an AI framework, which really the current legislation does not give particular sets of controls or security parameters surrounding artificial intelligence. Yes, you can enact your rights under GDPR to ask if it is true anonymization for a human to review it, but how would you actually know that as the consumer, whether it is or isn't at the point of when it actually happens? Yes, the privacy notice should be clear, but how many of us have actually sat there and read through all the terms and conditions when you've signed up to things and read the privacy policy? I suppose that ties quite nicely to what are the potential issues with AI? Obviously, AIs are trained. They use training data sets to obviously determine outcomes. Is it bias in the AI? Quality of the training data? Location of that data? Where do we think the issues are arising if it is being seen more and more? Neil, you seem to have had some input and thoughts on that. I'll start with you.
So the issue I'd like to focus on is not the one that people talk about. Yes, AI can be biased. Humans can be biased. There's a really big issue that I think is just going to keep creeping up, whatever fixes you put in. So the first thing is that these are decision-making systems. And there's, I think, some sort of naive sense that if an AI does it, then the decisions are going to be right, which is not true. The decisions are going to be wrong. So you first of all have to accept that the decisions will often be wrong. And once you've accepted that they're going to be wrong, then how do you want them to be wrong is a question. And so what do I mean by that? So AI systems, and I've been in meetings with judges where they've said how wonderful it is that these systems are very consistent, because judges aren't consistent, and you can show this. The studies, there's studies that are flawed, which talk about judges deciding after lunch that turn out to be a misrepresentation of what happens. But still, humans are not consistent around decision making. For example, you can read Kahneman on that. Thinking Fast and Slow has a lot on that. And so if you're inconsistent, clearly that's a bad thing, because you can't be correct. You can't all be correct if you're inconsistent. But once you accept that you're not going to make correct decisions, you are given a choice about how you make errors. And if you choose to make consistent errors, that's highly problematic. And there's a massive bias across these systems and human instinct, and it's in there in Kahneman as well, about how important it is that we show consistency to drive these systems towards consistent decision-making, whereas humans, rather wonderfully, make inconsistent decisions. What does that mean? That means that if you are in a group that is being unfairly discriminated against, if you are in the human world, you will occasionally get lucky because the error won't be made. But in the AI world, you are consistently discriminated against. And if we do things like we look at protected characteristics and we prove that we're not discriminating against those groups, you end up with the potential to be creating more groups that you don't observe directly that you are discriminating against. And this is a massive problem because it goes totally against humans' instincts that one should create an algorithm that is inconsistent about its answers. But if you look at how humans behave, it's one of the beauties of our decision-making that you will get a chance, even if you are a discriminated person, because occasionally that discrimination will go against your way. And what does this mean for society? It means horrible things for society overall, that if you are in one of these minorities, you're constantly facing this problem. And it's to do with the scale at which these systems are being deployed. and making these consistent decisions. How do you legislate against that? I don't know. It's very, very difficult. And it's something that I don't even see properly discussed, because it goes beyond the conversations we tend to have about bias and fairness and inconsistent training data, and becomes much more something philosophical about how you'd like to be treated, and very difficult to sort of explain to someone, well, we built an AI system that's going to be inconsistent about how it makes decisions.
Very interesting, and I think you touched very neatly on points of data there. Beth, Maria, anything you wanted to add there?
Yeah, I think it's interesting that when people have tried to scale up human decision making into a more algorithmic system through survey work, MIT did this thing around the trolley problem. We see human ethics bending towards something that we might have more of an intuitive problem with. So that MIT survey asked, like, what should an automated vehicle be more likely to hit in the case of an accident? What should it choose to avoid? And that meant that humans were inputting values on different types of protected characteristics, as have been mentioned, but also medical conditions, state of homelessness, pregnancy, age, all these things came in as a factor. So the problem also arises where you try to take that messiness of human decision making and quantify it in a way that can be put into a system. I mean, no one actually implemented the MIT survey into an automated car, as far as I'm aware. But the kind of public response to that survey was that gut reaction of, actually, no, I think it's actually a bit bad that we've come out with this group consensus. And I think it goes back to Neil's point that actually sometimes our inconsistencies lead to virtuous ethics just because we're inconsistent. And if we get rid of that messiness by trying to codify human behavior, as so many people think you can kind of plop codified human behavior into artificial intelligence and that fixes a problem, then we're going to get these kinds of things that we will have to have a kind of a generalized pushback against. And that's because we can't agree uniformly by numbers on any particular ethical system. That's why we are so multitudinous, and that causes problems. And I don't have an answer for that. I think that's one of the wonderful things as an anthropologist I find so interesting to study, but it doesn't fit naturally into quantifiable, codifiable systems. And maybe we need to be really careful that we don't end up thinking it can be.
I suppose that's very interesting. In actually, should some systems with some data ever be codified, because of the concerns that Neil highlighted? Maria.
That's a very good question. And I love that both Neil and Beth have not gone into the usual suspects of what are the biggest threats of AI. And to complement or to add to what they said from an organizational perspective, where I think that we will see big challenges is again in the nature of AI, is that we are dealing with a stochastic technology in a very deterministic fashion. And this creates a huge tension in organizations that have not just a high degree of complexity, but they have got this degree of complexity because the history they have. So if you look at even Facebook, that's 17 years old, or Google, that's 26 years old, or Microsoft, that's 47 years old, to IBM, that's 101-year-old. What all those companies have in common is size and complexity, and that says one thing, that if we want to operate AI and be in control, no matter what we choose to codify and automate, we need to be ready. We need to have the right mindset and the right procedure to operate this novel machine, and we don't have it because, realistically, the only companies that have AI at scale, Google and Amazon and Facebook to a certain extent, they are not very open about their operation. How on earth are they on top of AI at scale, AI as an entity, and AI as not a general purpose technology, but a large infrastructure? And how do we start updating what we have to be fit for purpose? Would we see a collapse of existing organization and a recreation of organization in cloud, where features powered by technology within AI will be there seamlessly? That's a big question. That's a good question. It was very interesting. I've read an IDC study that said that most of the AI, 80%, they were estimated, 10% of the AI will enter the market via existing platforms and solutions. So will not be standalone technology where we can assess, because we know that that's labeled to be AI, will be the big ERP, CRM platforms that will continuously add machine learning and NLP and driven features, and we don't even know they exist. And to me, that's the second real danger, is the fact that those technology will be embedded in existing solutions, and because we don't have a way to audit and discern where AI is and or where AI makes an impact compared with the rest of the technology stack, will be very difficult to actually make some informed decision and actually have this exercise that both Beth and Neil were talking about. How much of our beautiful messiness of humanity we ended up automating and codifying, because it might be done without us even knowing, either by inertia or by utility or by the desire to optimize. Ultimately, what I see that will be going to be the big enemy of AI for humanity will be capitalism, ultimately, because we love to optimize. Capitalism pushes us to continuously optimize and increase productivity, and with that, AI gives us the perfect tool to do that. And in the rush to achieve that higher level of optimization, we might lose the messiness of humanity. And how we will balance that, I don't know. As Neil doesn't know, Beth doesn't know, I don't know, and I'm not very optimistic in that field, to be honest.
And I think rightly so. And I suppose it comes down to, when things go wrong, who's responsible for fixing it? And is it sometimes even possible to fix it? After you, Beth.
Yeah, so this goes back, for me, to my point about making sure people understand actually what AI is and not personify it, because there can also be arguably, I think Joanna Bryson has argued this before, she's a very well-known AI ethicist, that the push to personification of AI is a distraction from the responsibility being placed at the door of corporations who might actually be, legally suable for these sorts of incidents. And I think we see this with some of the test cases with automated vehicles, that it's putting more and more emphasis on what the vehicle itself sees. So actually the representation of the road and the visualization of what the AI sees is nothing like it's actually seeing. I think Jack Stilgom has made this point before, who's an expert on automated vehicles. So we need to be careful that the narratives being sold by corporations don't distract us from placing responsibility on them for products that they are products and not agents, and they aren't sold as agents with actual real agency.
Definitely. Neil, I can see you've unmuted. After yourself.
Yeah, I just wanted to reinforce that. I mean, if you look at the two Tesla cases I've read most about, the famous one of the death in California, in Florida, of the camera failing, there was an explicit decision, as I understand it, taken by Tesla to not put LiDAR on that system because it's expensive and not available as part of a standard car. And the radar, the camera washed out, and the radar was set low enough that it didn't see the top of the truck. So, and you can read the NTSB report. There's a full report, very interesting, on what went wrong. And the car plowed underneath the truck at 70 miles an hour, while I think the driver was watching something on DVD. I think less well known and shocking that it isn't publicized, the same accident happened again in Florida with a different model of car. And what's really interesting is, why are we not seeing a sort of a movement to deal with that through product liability? As I think we have seen some work with the Uber case, which also is, I mean, there's just enormous failings in the processes around what they were doing, which was testing an autonomous vehicle. They weren't, the driver, the safety driver was watching, I think, the US American Idol or something like that, and had more than enough time to see this unfortunate individual who didn't hear or recognize the car was coming, and the car failed to recognize the individual themselves because they were a pedestrian pushing a bicycle, which confused the underlying systems. And every time the systems got confused, the car stopped tracking the vehicle, and they disabled all of the Volvo's standard safety systems, which would have brought the car to a halt. Now, there's a bunch of stuff going on here, which is about how do you conduct testing on public roles that's nothing to do with AI, that would be for any system, whether that was a plain autopilot? I mean, you think in some sense these are autopilots, and about what the interface is with the human. So to a large degree, I think that the sort of calls for specific AI regulation are a bit misguided. I think it's particularly odd what the EU have chosen to do in their recent regulation, which is try and define AI. I disagree. People wanted disagreement. They didn't actually, but let's have some disagreement. I disagree with Maria that it's important to define AI. I think it's dangerous too, because actually it's a word that means something to people and you can't own it. You can't take it off them. They'll interpret it as they see fit. And I've learned that when I've tried to educate people on what I think AI is. It's that, no, their view dominates, they're in the majority, I can't own the term. But the EU recent regulations have tried to define what AI is, and then have tried to legislate around that. It's pointless. Legislate on outcome, as we already do. I mean, we already have a load of automated systems, and we legislate on the outcome and the effect on the consumer, and that's much, much easier to do. Where there are gaps which are emerging because of these new phenomena, like the one we talked about earlier, where you're deploying large systems at scale that are making consistent decisions, think about new legislation in those gaps, or monitor the market there. But don't legislate for things that don't exist, that are sort of fantasies, would be my answer. And take a lot closer look at what some companies, because it's certainly not all of them in developing automated vehicles. Some are being extremely careful and some are not. And it would be nice to see those that are not getting some penalty for what they're doing.
Definitely. I think consequence is very important to action. Maria.
Can I respond to what Neil was saying? Disagree with me saying that we need to define AI. The way we have done it was for a very specific purpose. We just wanted to put the minds of our decision-making at rest on them having their own definition on AI. We just wanted to focus on what technologies we have available and how do we best use it and invest in it so that we can achieve some concrete advantages. So it was for that narrow purpose. And we still advise our clients to attempt to give not so much a definition about taxonomy of AI, what sort of technology you're using, at what use cases you have. And when we start moving away from AI and its definition into a more hands-on set of technology, suddenly all that personal and sometimes impassionate conversation about AI, what AI is and what is not, gets out of the way of doing the right things. And that's the purpose we have done it. But I agree with you, the way European Commission has gone about attempting to define AI and regulate AI, it's not the best one. And it's not just that myself, I agree, most of my colleagues, and we'll see lots of problems coming down the way because of this attempt to define and regulate something that is so fuzzy and difficult to define.
Definitely. Beth, did you want to add anything there? I could see you nodding along.
Yeah, I agree. On the definition of AI, just a personal anecdote as an anthropologist, that's basically all I produce. But I think it's worth remembering this fact. So a while ago, I was getting a taxi to the train station to get on a flight, to get on a train, to get on a flight, to go to a conference on AI. And the taxi driver very kindly asked me, what are you up to? And I said, I'm doing this, I'm going to an AI conference. And he said, oh, that's wonderful. I think AI is a wonderful technology that will really help people because artificial insemination helps so many people have babies. So we need to remember that AI doesn't instantly click for everyone in the general public as being artificial intelligence, and that actually the whole concept of artificial intelligence for many people is completely obscure. And perhaps if I'd said I was going to a conference on robots, perhaps that might have hit harder. And so there's a whole, it's the old Donald Rumsfeld who's very mocked for it, but the unknown unknowns, in a sense, that some people just don't have this on their horizon. The public discourse hasn't reached them. And we need to engage those people as well, because they are citizens and they should have input into the direction of which this is going.
Definitely. And I think it's incredibly interesting that AI and many acronyms are quite often misunderstood. I've had GDPR quoted at me in different manners of not general data protection regulation and all sorts of other words being quoted in between, and AI as actionable intelligence, as you have obviously seen, artificial insemination. That is definitely one I have not come across yet. That is incredibly interesting to see. We are, I'm afraid, at time. I think this has been a incredibly interesting debate with different points of view, perspectives, understandings, and overall, I think we're all united in the understanding that there does need to be further understanding across the breadth and depth of organizations, and there should be clear accountability, not thrown at governments or the people. It's your fault because you didn't fill in the form wrong. Actually, the people doing the processing should be held accountable for their actions, and therefore obviously understand that by using artificial intelligence, you do create risk, and you've got to understand that risk. If you don't understand that risk, don't do it. I think it's probably the easiest and best advice I think I've always been given by fellow lawyers is if you don't understand it, don't jump into the pit. I'm afraid we weren't able to get to everyone's questions. I have tried to incorporate them as we've gone through, but it's been a lively chat, which is fantastic to see. And thank you for everyone joining us. This video will be available, as I said at the beginning, on our YouTube channel. For the British Computer Society. You can literally go into Google, type in British Computer Society YouTube channel, it will pop up and you will see these lovely people in a few days' time there with a fresh video for you to watch. If we can ask you to pop over and give it a like, that's always beneficial. And also, I'm sure you can see everyone's name on the screen there. I'm sure most of us, if not all of us, are on LinkedIn or some sort of platform, and you saw Beth's details there at the beginning. So do feel free to go and say hi and continue the conversation there. And obviously, thank you very much for my panel of providing your very valuable time and your input. And it has been a real pleasure to being able to facilitate and hear your points of view on different interesting and a very dynamic topic. Do you want to give just very quickly, just a couple of, 20 seconds closing remark? We are over time, but I want to give you a chance to give your closing remarks. I'll kick off with Beth, and then I'll go to Neil, and then I'll go to Maria.
Okay, yes, just very briefly, I think it's very important that people understand the stories that we tell ourselves about artificial intelligence and where they might distract us from actually dealing with the actual societal impacts. I think that's my bottom line.
Definitely. Neil?
Yeah, I guess maybe there's a really interesting question to turn around to you. Where is BCS in all this? Because to be honest, the BCS was a bit of the bane of my life as a machine learning researcher in a computer science department. I was constantly told this wasn't core degree material, and we had to constantly justify the fact that we were teaching it for about 15 years. And I think that there's really open questions, as I think Beth hinted out earlier, about what professionalization is needed, how is it needed? It definitely should not be imposed too quickly. And where does the BCS sort of stand on that? Because I think a lot of errors were made around software engineering professionalization, and perhaps we're facing the consequence of those errors now. So I think there's a really interesting question sort of thrown back towards the BCS in terms of what position it wants to take if it is the Chartered Institute for the IT professional.
Most certainly. Maria.
I've been called Marie. I mean, I'm Romanian, so Marie is French. If there's one thing that I would like everyone to invite is to participate. We can't allow for AI to be done to us. We have to be part of doing AI together. And there are so many ways you can participate, from all the public consultations that are being run by the government for public policies or the regulators, but also being part of those conversations, because by acquiring a higher understanding of what AI is and what AI is not, you are able not only to participate and bring your point of view from wherever you are into discussion, but also help others achieve that understanding, because ultimately AI will be embedded in the fabric of our society. And there's a limited window of opportunity where we can still get it right. But we need all of you. It's not just for Beth, Neil, and a bunch of us around the world. We need much more knowledgeable people to join us and lead this revolution in the right direction.
Definitely. And I think also the message is read the privacy notice, because they will have to tell you transparency is one of the fundamental principles of the law. Thank you so much for our panel, and thank you so much for those closing remarks. I think there's some fantastic items there, and item I will pick up internally as well, Neil, in asking what are we doing on that, and I will come back to you on that as well. Thank you so much all for your time, and have a lovely evening.
Thanks, Dan. Thanks, everyone.